Hi, my name's Kirstie Page, and in this video, we're going to talk about how having a greater capability to identify gaps and understand the gap closing process can support us as teachers, practitioners, but particularly as leaders in terms of raising attainment. So, when we're thinking about having a systematic approach to raising attainment, we definitely need that clear leadership strategy and focus. And I'll start right from the beginning to say, of course, the quality of our teaching and the systems we use is really important. So, for example, with phonics, the SSP you use has to be taught consistently and well. But I think alongside our curriculum, alongside programs like SSPs, as leaders, we need to have a sense of the children's gaps and the issues that a few or a lot of our children face so that we can kind of have that dual approach to raising attainments. Because what we will find is that a strong curriculum, strong teaching, consistent delivery of a quality SSP will work really well for some children or for most of our children, depending on where you work. But there will be always children who have issues with readiness and progression. And it will only be by having a systematic approach to gap identification and gap closing that we can truly raise attainment for certain children, certain target groups, and to see this approach as underpinning our more formal learning and then sitting alongside our curriculum and our the programs that we might implement. Let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So, as a leader, of course, I'm going to want to be raising attainment, even if I'm doing well, even if our school or setting is already doing quite well. It's something that will drive me forwards all of the time. But when I have a focus for it, I'll probably have a focus for different reasons, and we'll go through what are the main kind of focus strategies in this first section. So one might be that I have just a desire to raise attainment with a certain key area of child development, because I realise that quite a lot of my children have got gaps with this skill or set of skills. And I also see the correlation and the link between lower levels of development within this area and the outcomes that we have higher up this school. So I really just want to very broadly work as many of my children towards age-related expectations and remove gaps from these areas as quickly as I can. And for a lot of schools, certainly they might have a strategy based around speech, language, and communication, because that is the skill that most people are most concerned about. And it might even be a chunk of speech, language, and communication. So it might be that we have a vocabulary strategy because we are aware of the impact that vocabulary gaps have on writing, reading comprehension, problem solving, mathematical understanding, cross-curricular issues. Or it might be that I have a development focus such as personal, social, and emotional development, and that might be for all of my children. It might be within a certain kind of phase of school, such as in the early years, because we realise that we've got to put a lot of core skills in place for a lot of our children when they walk through the door. Or it might be that this is just something that we look at for a target group of children, perhaps. These are all just possibilities. But whether I'm focusing on speech, language, and communication, or just vocabulary, or personal, social, and emotional, then having that kind of greater understanding of what are the different skills, what are the different skill areas that make up this area of development, and that sense of what are the age-related expectations associated with those skills is crucial, so that I can have that stage versus age gap identification process, but also so that I understand the incremental process that I've got to take some or all of my children through in order to improve levels of skill, and therefore attainment because of that progression in this area of development. It might be that as a leader, I kind of have a strategy that, excuse me, is more focused on an aspect of formal learning. And again, these are just all possibilities. It might be that I think, well, for us, for our school, or for our multi-academy trust, or for certain schools in our local authority, for example, phonics is the thing that we have to focus on first. Or it might be writing, or it might be wider reading, for example. And it might be that we think this is our school priority. This is very much part of our improvement plan. How do we have a gap identification and gap closing approach underpinning and sitting alongside what we already do? And by doing that, we can become increasingly aware of the developmental skills that feed into that aspect of formal learning. Future newsletters will unpick phonics and writing and reading in more detail. We're kind of introducing kind of an overall concept in this video. But I am aware what skills feed into that aspect of formal learning. What skill level is readiness? We always talk about whether children are ready or not ready, but what exactly is it, exactly, specifically, that children need in order to be ready, and what are the skill levels that support ongoing progression? So just as a quick example, for example, if I want my children to move into phonics and quite quickly be able to blend so that they can use the phonic approach to read words, I know that they will need a sequential auditory memory capacity of 3 so that they can hold 3 things in that auditory memory in the right order, which will underpin blending. But I know, for example, that to blend 4 phoneme words and to blend at the level that you need to get through the phonics screening check, that sequential auditory memory capacity will have to have gone up to at least 4 items so that they can begin to blend 4 phoneme words. It might be that my leadership strategy is focused on a certain target group. And that might be because what we're doing works quite well for most of our children, but there is a certain group of children where we're needing to look a bit more closely. We're going to need to have to think a little bit more about what we need to do to ensure that those children make progress. So naturally, they might be children who have identified SEND with more specific and significant needs. Obviously, some of these things will overlap here. It might be that those children are classed as coming from more deprived households. Our targets and the agenda to close that deprivation gap is huge. So we have to really not have a blanket approach to that, but to actually have a look at what the impact deprivation has had on different children and what that means to their developmental profile. Or it might be that there's a gender edge to this. It might be that I really want to improve writing, but particularly boys' writing, for example. And again, looking at the developmental skill gaps can be really useful for that gender strategy, because certainly as an ex-speech and language therapist, for every 1 girl I saw, we would have had probably about 6 boys on the caseload. So we need to be aware that if we've got that strategy, then child development and the higher likelihood of having skill gaps, what impact that will have on that strategy. So in terms of those target children that make up whatever vulnerable group or whatever target group we're thinking about, what are those target children like? What are their skill gaps? What are their skill strengths? what would their next steps be, so that I move away from just having a general approach to trying to improve outcomes for that group to actually becoming really detailed and really systematic about what exactly is acting as a barrier for these children, and what is it that I need to put in place to, as quickly as possible, remove the barrier for some of those children, or at least ensure progression for all of those children. And last but not least, as a leader, I might have a very specific data outcome in mind. And of course, all of those things that we've just talked about in relation to a phonics strategy or in relation to a speech, language, and communication development strategy will all have an impact on the data measures that we will have within schools. But it might be that I want to have, as a leader, initially a very focus driven strategy for that measured outcome purpose. So it might be that that is GLD if we're working in England, which is that good level of development at the end of reception. And again, at the minute, obviously, most of us will have the agenda of significantly raising targets in individual schools, but across groups of schools for GLD, and particularly with our more deprived children. So this is a big one at the minute. Our phonics screening check perhaps is something that we want to really focus on and target. Or it might be that there are other measures of wider reading and writing as well that might be our specific focus. So whatever our strategy, whether it's development, whether it's a measurable outcome, kind of specific strategy, or whether it's an aspect of formal learning that we're focusing on, then in an ideal world, I really want a two-pronged approach to gap identification and gap closing. And it might be that you want to start with one and then move on to the other. But in an ideal world, I want a strategy for my older children and a strategy for a bottom-up strategy for my younger children, and that they will gradually feed through to one another. So let's kind of just talk about that a tiny bit. So with my older children, gap identification and gap closing capability gives me the ability to take an older child who is struggling with this, or who is possibly not likely to get the outcomes I need, and look at what are the gaps that are acting as barriers for that child, and to do something about them. So that might be that, particularly at the beginning of the school year, I look at children, again, this is if you're in England, I look at children in my Key Stage 1 class or classes who are the ones who are at risk of not getting through the phonics screening check, or who might get through, but it will be a push. Who are they? Let's have a look for those narrow set of skills that feed into phonic reading. What are the gaps that are acting as barriers? And through the course of the year, how can I incrementally close those gaps and remove those barriers? And that might be my Key Stage 1 children, but it also might be a principle that I use as children are older, but who still have issues with this aspect of learning. Or it might be that I look at my children in reception who are down as not likely to get the GLD. Well, what is it about their skill gaps and their skill profile that is acting as a barrier? What is it? I suppose for both of these things, if you're going to talk about needing to push the children and put in a lot of effort to raise outcomes and to get children through these measures, what exactly is it that you're going to be pushing? And it will be the identification of skill gaps that can really support us. But even with older children beyond reception, for my children in Key Stage 1 who didn't get GLD, why didn't they get GLD? What are the skill gaps that prevented them from getting GLD? And therefore, what does my provision in year 1, year 2 and beyond need to look like for those children to continue to remove those barriers. So this kind of idea about taking children who are already identified as finding something tricky or possibly not going to achieve a certain outcome, but then we begin to kind of troubleshoot and look for gaps and tackle those gaps. That approach can also work where children have wider issues with learning, retention, and progression. And that could be within mainstream classes. It could also be within what some people call nurture classes. It could also be within a resourced provision attached to a mainstream school, or it could be a kind of leadership, more general approach. If I'm using gap identification and gap closing within a specialist provision or a special school. That's very much kind of an approach that I can use. And really, what we're saying is if I'm looking at improving this for this child, what is it that are the gaps that are acting as barriers? What are the next steps? And how can we close those gaps and remove those barriers through what I call informed interventions? So, when we're putting time and effort into these children, the activities and the skills that we're working on are informed by our findings of gap identification and setting of next steps. So what we do is we move away from generic one size fits all interventions, where our interventions become more bespoke because of our greater knowledge and understanding of what children need. And as children make progress, we can tweak those informed interventions to keep that ball rolling. But also, I don't want this to be just about interventions. I want to working on those skills and those next steps to be woven into quality first teaching. And again, across the curriculum wherever possible. So if I want to work on a child's sequential auditory memory in order to increase the likelihood that they move towards blending, then I don't want to be thinking that I'm only going to work on that in phonic interventions and in phonic lessons. How can I work on that across the curriculum? How could we maybe weave that into PE? How could we weave that into other lessons as well? But as well as having that older child, almost like troubleshooting, kind of almost like that diagnostic edge to my strategy, I also want to track it back, and that is really important. I think although gap identification can help you do that troubleshooting, in an ideal world, we really want to have a bottom-up strategy where we go back as early as possible to identify and tackle gaps, but to put key skills in place so that over time, less of our children have this issue later on, or if there are ongoing gaps, we already know about them right from the beginning and they're not as extensive as they would have been. So, as I've already mentioned, we go as early as possible. So, again, if you've got a 2-year-old provision, this is very meaningful from the very start of our work with children. And in relation to the key skills that are really important for us to put in place in order to raise outcomes and attainment, what does my current EYFS provision look like for those skills? And then if we're going to weave gap identification and gap closing, how do we identify children's gaps? How do we identify children's differing starting points with these key skills as soon as possible? And how do we weave a systematic approach to building these skills, taking children's gaps and starting points into consideration, just as part of our EYFS practice, but we have a really systematic approach. And I get that this is not an easy option. It's not what I would call a sticking plaster solution where we implement an isolated intervention program 3 times a week and then carry on just the same outside of that. This is a commitment from leadership, and then for all of your team to follow that commitment. It takes time and effort, and there is that not just leadership commitment is fundamental, but then bringing along with that is that commitment with your wider team to having an upskilling process and a systematic approach to gap identification and gap closing. And I suppose what we're doing really within this is we know that children's gaps have a huge impact on their levels of readiness, on their ability to make progress. And really, by having this systematic approach, we're embracing children's gaps, we're identifying them and exploring them rather than just ignoring them. We are very likely to get the outcomes if we embrace this approach because it acts on pure developmental principles, which are the same principles that speech and language therapists or educational psychologists would follow. And really, although it's not a sticking plaster or a quick fix approach, it really also supports us to get off what I call that intervention hamster wheel, so that what we're doing is we're weaving interventions and we're weaving gap closing into our EYFS practice, but also into our teaching and learning process, not just in EYFS, but beyond, so that we see intervention as embedded into our practice and into our teaching and learning. And I think by making this commitment, it's a longer term, more sustainable approach. And we know from lots of people who have already embraced this approach that outcomes will follow because we are, like I said before, we're following those pure developmental principles. So like I said before, future newsletters will look more specifically and in more detail about phonics, about writing, about reading, as well as broader areas of child development such as speech, language and communication. This recording goes alongside newsletter 1, but you might not necessarily be watching it alongside newsletter 1. But if you are, but you haven't signed up for these newsletters, or you know somebody else who wants to sign up directly for the newsletters, then if you email us at toolkit@launchpadforliteracy.co.uk, we can sort that out for you, no problem. Okay, thanks for your time.